So this is an SRI 8610 GC with a thermal conductivity detector. Sometimes we call it a TCD for short. And the TCD detector can sometimes require servicing. So the first step in the servicing of the TCD detector is to remove the 8 wires that are connected to this terminal board right here. You'll notice that there's 2 red wires, 2 blue wires, 2 green wires, and 2 black wires. So inside this there are 4 little tiny filaments. So we need to measure the resistance of those filaments, and we use an ohm meter, which is a voltmeter that has an ohm setting, to measure the resistance of the filaments. Now the funny thing is, it's not between the red and the red. One of the filaments is a red and a blue, and the other filament is a red and a green. So I just happened by luck to pick the correct one, and it's reading 34 ohms, which is the correct reading at room temperature. But now if I measure the other filament, the red and the green, I get a reading that's extremely high. So that shows that that particular filament is damaged. So unfortunately there's nothing to do except to replace the filament. So to replace the filament, you've got to get the detector out of this insulated box. So the detector actually looks like this. It's a box in a box in a box, and it has to be because the TCD detector is a thermal conductivity detector, so the temperature of this block, this metal block in here, has to be very, very constant. So it has to be buried in layers of insulation. So if we take the little cap off here and then carefully pull out some of the insulation without damaging it, you'll see that this is buried in that box. That's what this is. So I'm not going to take this box out. We're just going to pretend that we're taking this box out. But there's 4 tubes that are connected to that box that run through the wall of the oven and then connect to various places on the inside of the GC. Now it's not important for this video to go into that very deeply. Just when you take this one out, make good note of where the 4 tubes are, because you do have to pull this whole thing out in order to replace the filaments. So now we're going to take this over to a vise, because it's easier to do this work in a vise. So let's go over to the vise. So here we are over at the vise, and I've got my TCD detector assembly out of the GC. So let's disassemble this. So there's a couple of hex head screws that come out. Okay, and I'm going to make a little magic marker mark here, just so that I don't have to work as hard to put it back together. I'll make a little mark so that I can see where it goes. And then we pull the aluminum box apart, carefully remove the insulation. And then you can see we have this heavy stainless steel block. Now I'm not going to disassemble this one any further, but essentially that heavy block looks like this. So we'll take this and we'll put it in the vise. Now you want to make sure you don't crush any of the tubes that are connected to it. So put it in the vise in such a way that you're not going to be damaging any of the tubes. So now this is what the filament looks like. It's got 2 long wires that are connected, and then it's got this nut. It's called a gland nut, and you'll need a wrench like this to remove it. So it's possible to just use an open end wrench, but what we prefer is to take a box wrench like this and slide it down over the tubing so that we get a really good connection on that gland nut. So you remove the gland nut, and if you're lucky, the filament just pops right out. Well, that's what the filament looks like. I don't know if you can see that on the video, but the filament is actually missing. It's gone. And that's probably why it wasn't working, was because the filament had totally disappeared. So here's one where you can see the tiny little filament wire. Now a new filament comes in a box. As of 2015, these are about $90 each. So they come in a little protective box. and you got to handle them very carefully because you don't want to damage this little delicate filament there right at the end. Now we also need a little gasket, a little copper gasket. So I'm going to take the one off there, and I have a new one. You should get a new copper gasket with every filament. So you can see what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the gasket. Do that again. So I'm going to very carefully put that copper gasket over the filament, and then put that filament carefully into the hole, and then the nut, the gland nut, you have to slide that over the insulation. And then put everything in there without damaging anything. There we go. Okay, so this again gets tight, and it really needs to be really, really tight, because if it leaks, the detector is not going to work very well. So have a nice good wrench with the box side, and then tighten it up really tight. Now what can happen sometimes, unfortunately, is that the filament doesn't come out as easily as it did for this demonstration. So what you need to do then is you need to somehow get that bad filament out there. Now it might be seized in there because of the heat. So what you do is you get a pair of pliers and you grab the filaments as close as you can to the block, and then you pry the filament out, and if you're lucky, out it'll come. Probably gets a little bit damaged in the process, but that's unavoidable if it's seized up in there. Now if you still can't get the filament out, then what we need to do is we need to cut the filaments off as close as we can to the cell, and then take and drill that filament out. So in this case, I'm fortunate enough that I have something called a drill press. You may not have this, but if you do, it's a big convenience. So I'm going to chuck this in the drill press, and then using the drill press's very precise controls, I can get this and then turn on the drill press and then drill that filament out. Now with any luck, just the violence of the drill bit is enough to break the filament free, and then it'll pop out and everything will be fine. But you do have to be careful to use a small drill at first and not damage the sealing surface. If you scratch the sealing surface where the little copper gasket would keep the filament from leaking, then of course we have to buy a new detector block. It's not really easily repairable if you damage that sealing surface. So start with a small drill, make sure it's right in the center of the filament as you go down, and then if you have to expand to a bigger drill, why of course, then do that. So that's really the story on how to